Okay, the door is closed, so time to start. If you're here to dream away to a warm Hawaiian island, this is definitely the wrong session. But I can promise you a session about a hot topic, because .NET MAUI has nothing to do with the island. It's not even a code name. It's just an acronym for Multi-Platform Application UI. So .NET Multi-Platform Application UI is the official name of it, but often we just say .NET MAUI or just MAUI. Yeah, and why is this so slow? No, okay. .NET MAUI is more or less not something new. It's the next generation of Xamarin.Forms. So we can say it's like Xamarin.Forms 6.0 with big breaking changes. So this is what I will talk about today. I will guide you through the basic. I will show you some code, both .NET MAUI and .NET MAUI Blazor hybrid, and show you how to get started with that. And my name is Hindrikes. I'm a mobile developer, but I'm doing a lot of other stuff too, like Cloud, Azure, working for 1337, based in Borlänge. Love this thing by sharing knowledge. Have written 2 books, do a lot of stuff on YouTube right now. So if you want to see more content about .NET MAUI and Blazor, I recommend you to go and subscribe to my YouTube channel, because I publish content at least once a week, and also doing some live streams there if you want to interact with me and ask questions live. So go to YouTube and you will find me there. Just search for my name. So .NET MAUI is part of the big unification of .NET. It all started with .NET 5. That should be the big unification of the .NET platform, but we have a pandemic and a lot of other stuff that took longer time than Microsoft first expected. So .NET MAUI was released in the .NET 6 wave or .NET 6 timeframe. It was not the release in the initial .NET 6 release, but it was released this spring, so it have been out in a stable state for about 4 months now. But even if .NET MAUI right now is a stable release, the tooling are still in preview. The Visual Studio on Mac still have some work to do, but on Windows I think it works pretty good. It's usable on Mac too, and you will see my demos today on Visual Studio for Mac. But the vision with .NET MAUI is that it should be the most productive way to develop native apps that perform great on any device that run iOS, Android, Windows, Mac, and all that from a single code base. And I really like that they say that it's a multi-platform framework, as you can hear in the name, not the cross-platform, because I think the word cross-platform has some negative things to it. It's more like compromise on all platforms. .NET MAUI helps you build for a multi-platform in a good way, and mostly from a single code base. So .NET MAUI. So why did they change the name from Xamarin.Forms, and why they dropped the Xamarin brand completely? Yeah, it's because of the unification project, of course, but also the name Xamarin.Forms maybe thinks, okay, this is only for apps building simple form maps. People think that, but that is not the case. You can build any app with Xamarin.Forms, and if the Xamarin.Forms library or .NET MAUI library not have the control for you, you can always opt into the native platform that are below it in a really easy way, and you can use C#. If you compare that with other frameworks, React Native for example, you cannot do that. Then you need to go back to Objective-C or Swift for example to build a plugin on for React Native. So .NET MAUI using .NET 6, and we will have a new major version together with every .NET major version. So when we have .NET 7 later this year, we will also have MAUI on .NET 7. And something that is completely new for Xamarin platforms or Xamarin.Forms is the project. Before you have the old .NET Framework project structure in the in the project file, you know, this thing that you don't want to open because there are so much text that you want to just close the computer and go and drink some coffee instead. But with the .NET MAUI and also for .NET for iOS and .NET for Android and so on, you will have this SDK styled project with much less stuff in it, so you can edit it yourself, for example, without being mad on it. And with .NET MAUI, you also have one single project for all the platforms. It's using the feature called multi-targeting, so that you can specify multiple projects, not projects, you can have multiple target frameworks in one project, compared to Xamarin.Forms where you have one head project for each platform. So if you build for iOS and Android, you have one iOS project, one Android project, and then you have one project with the shared code. Now you can have everything in one shared project, and that is the default. Then you can of course break out things in separate projects in Visual Studio to have a more structure, but you don't need to have those head projects. And you will also reuse resources like images, font files in a better way compared to Xamarin.Forms. Then you also have improved architecture, and this is good in many ways. The best way is that you will get better performance, but it will also make .NET MAUI easier to extend. For example, there were a lot of talk about that you could use other ways of write apps than XAML, like MVU or Blazor syntax. You don't have that out of the box right now, but it will be easy for Microsoft to add that, because they can just build a small layer on top of everything else. And there are open source projects like Comet that are already doing that. But as I said, you can use .NET MAUI for Windows, for macOS, iOS, Android, iPadOS, and Android tablets. So you can use it basically for everything. It's not just a mobile framework, it's for everything that runs those operating systems. So here you can see one example how the single projects can look. I will show you this in Visual Studio later also, but you have this project, and then you have the platforms folder, and here you place everything that are platform specific, like the Android manifest, info plist for iOS. And then if you select to build for iOS, it will include the iOS files. If you select to build for Android, it will include the Android files, and using conditional compile in some way for that. Okay, so how does .NET MAUI work? Yeah, .NET MAUI is fully native. Everything runs in the native process, and at least the most of the UI is native controls. So even if you have a .NET MAUI control, this will render a native control. But if you take a look here, we can see that we have a layer with app code, and there is the layer where you will work. You will build your share code, like view models, views, business logic. I would say that you will spend 99% of your time in this layer when writing a .NET MAUI app. But then you also have some small things you need to do per platform. If you want background jobs, for example, push notifications, you need to implement that for each platform, or use some library that have done that for you in a plugin, for example. Then in .NET MAUI we have the .NET runtime, where that is where your .NET code runs. So all code that you write that are .NET are running inside here, but if you access the native APIs, it will run on the side and just access the native platform. And you have the .NET base class libraries, and yeah, that's just the libraries like system data, system IO, system link, and you can use all of them. When we're talking about .NET runtime, on the mobile platforms and Mac, it's still the Mono VM that runs, because Mono are more portable than the .NET runtime. So that will still be there, and that is also what you use for Blazor WebAssembly, for example. And then we have .NET for Android, .NET for iOS, and WinUI, and these are the bindings for each platform that makes it possible to access the native APIs. So it's more or less one-to-one mapping from what Apple, for example, offers for you, but they have .NETified it a bit with naming and how methods looks, for example. Then we have .NET MAUI, .NET Multi-Platform App UI, and this is more or less an abstraction layer with control descriptions and also handlers that maps those controls to native controls. And right now .NET MAUI have around 40 controls, layout and pages that you can use in your app out of the box. And mostly this is enough in many apps, but you can of course build your own controls, and there are a lot of third-party vendors building controls also, like Progress Telerik, you have Sync Fusion and others also, just to mention a few. And here we can see an example of two controls. We have the UI activity indicator and the progress bar, and how they will look when you build for iOS versus Android. But in .NET MAUI you will only use a control called activity indicator, and it will render those native controls from it, and you can see it will not look exactly the same on the platforms. And I think that is one of the strengths with .NET MAUI, that you will always get the native look even if you have a shared codebase for your UI code. Here another example of UA slider and seek bar. They are pretty similar, but they do not look the same. But in .NET MAUI you will have to use the slider control. The main way to build a UI in .NET MAUI is to use XAML or C#, if you want to do that. So, and use data bindings. I will show you more about that when we're doing some live coding later. But this short code will render this UI. It looks pretty the same, but you can see there are some platform specifics here also. For example, you look at the slider or at the title at the top, it looks like platforms. So if we take a look at the architecture in .NET MAUI, very simplified, it will look like this. This is an example for a button control. So we have an iButton interface, then we have the button handler and the native button. And then we have the .NET MAUI button that you use in XAML or C#. And that is the control that knows about the data binding stuff, for example. In Xamarin.Forms, we have a lot of that stuff also in the render that now is called handler. So if you heard about Xamarin.Forms renders, that is what is a handler in .NET MAUI. But the handler now only knows about the interface, and that makes it possible to easily add other ways of writing the UI, like a Blazor syntax. You maybe have heard about the experimental project called Mobile Blazor Bindings that they did for Xamarin.Forms. That will be much easier to do now when we have another architecture of .NET MAUI compared to Xamarin.Forms, because they only need to do the implementation here. They don't need to do the renders too, or if they use the renders that they had in Xamarin.Forms, they would have a lot of stuff that they don't need for the Blazor syntax. Or if you want to have some MVU pattern in .NET MAUI, for example, you have Comet framework for that. There was a lot of talk about MVU when they first introduced MAUI on build 2020 or something like that. They talk about that can be an option. Have a more MVU pattern, and you will write more focus in C# like Swift UI, for example. But right now there are no official way for Microsoft to do that, but you have the Comet project that you can take a look on if you're interested in that way to build UIs. You maybe heard about Blazor Hybrid or Blazor Desktop or Blazor Native. They have had a lot of different name of that. I don't really know why they call it Blazor Desktop, because it was not unique for desktop, it was also for mobile. But what you can do with Blazor is that you can write web code and you can have it inside of your app. So Blazor is not only for web. Now it's also for mobile. You can see this as the third hosting option for Blazor. You already have Blazor WebAssembly, Blazor Server, and now you have .NET MAUI Blazor. And Blazor will run inside of .NET MAUI. You will package it up with the app package. So you don't need a server, you don't have it run in WebAssembly, everything is in the app. And the only thing that are web are the actual HTML and CSS and all those stuff. But everything that is C#, even if it's inside of a Blazor component, are running in the native process. So that means that you have access to all the native APIs, even for your Blazor component, that you can reuse between your websites and the app also. So, okay, you cannot reuse code that are native on your web site, but if you're doing good architecture of interfaces and dependency injection, you can solve that in pretty easy way. And I will also show you an example of that later in this presentation. And you cannot only use Blazor WebView, that is the component is called for .NET MAUI. You can use it in Xamarin.Forms too if you have old Xamarin.Forms app that you would add this to it, but you can also use it for WinForms and VPF. And that makes it very easy to write applications for all of your stack. You maybe have some WinForms app that you want to modernize a bit, but you don't want to rewrite it from scratch directly. Then you can start to replace it part by part with the Blazor Web UI and reuse what you maybe already have for a website. And this Blazor Web View is just a normal .NET MAUI control, and that means that you can use it as the whole application, or you can just use it as a small part of an application. And that is good, for example, if you have some company-specific way to visualize data that you already have on your website. You can just take that Blazor component and bake it into your .NET MAUI app in the .NET MAUI page. So I think that is really powerful, and for me, this is the first time I think a hybrid approach really is interesting. I have always been against them before, but with the Blazor hybrid, I think there are scenarios where it can be useful. Okay, so .NET MAUI to .NET MAUI to Xamarin.Forms to .NET MAUI. If you have old apps, you of course want to upgrade them, but you don't need to go and do that in panic right now, because as I have understand it, you will have support of Xamarin.Forms already to 2024, so it's 2 years more. So no panic upgrading it. But what you need to do when you upgrade your Xamarin.Forms app is to update the CS project file, and the easiest way there is probably to create a new project and take your files into that project instead of going and rewrite the CS project file. You need to change all the Xamarin.Forms namespaces to Microsoft.MAUI or something like that. And if you have all custom renders in your Xamarin.Forms app, you can use something that is called compatibility renders. So you don't need to rewrite them to handlers. You can still use the code that you already have written, and that is good. And if you think this is complicated, you can try to use the .NET Upgrade Assistant. And this is nothing that are unique for .NET MAUI. You can use it for all .NET projects. But what you do there is you use the command line. You check if is this possible to upgrade with this. If so, yeah, you can go and see if it works. In most cases, it will work to use the Upgrade Assistant. But last time I tried it, it did not work on Mac, but they were working on support for Mac also. But on Windows, it's already there. So what about Xamarin Classic or Xamarin Native that some people call it? I don't like to call it native because Xamarin.Forms was also native controls and a native app. But what they mean with Xamarin Native is they use the native way to write apps. You write UI with storyboards on iOS, for example, Android XML files. because there are a lot of talk about .NET MAUI now, so no one really talks about that you can still do this. So Xamarin iOS is now called .NET for iOS, and Xamarin Android, .NET for Android, and what do you think Xamarin Mac is called? .NET for Mac, of course, or .NET for Mac Catalyst, because .NET MAUI are using Mac Catalyst. And Mac Catalyst is an Apple thing that they have done for taking iOS apps and run them on Mac. So it's more or less a wrapper for UIKit to AppKit. So, yeah. But if you use .NET for Mac, it's not Mac Catalyst. You can write a pure Mac app with .NET, like Visual Studio for Mac, for example, is running on that and on .NET 6. And that also makes Visual Studio for Mac right now really, really fast on those M1 devices, because it's running natively on them, because .NET 6 have support for that. Okay, let's go to Visual Studio and show some real code. So we will go here and create a new .NET MAUI project. So when we create a MAUI project, we have two options. We can create a .NET MAUI app, and we can create a .NET MAUI Blazor app. It's not that much of a different what you go with here. If you want to go with Blazor later and you have created a .NET MAUI app, you can pretty easy add those things for Blazor also. So you don't have to create the Blazor app just because you maybe want to use some Blazor content in the future. So you can just add that later. And here, target framework, the only options right now is .NET 6, but when we have .NET 7, you can probably select what framework you will use. So here we have a project default template, and you should not care about all those jar files, because that is a bug that they introduced in the latest version of Visual Studio Mac. I upgraded it earlier this week, and now they have all this strange stuff here. They had a similar bug before, but now they have reintroduced it. But they know about this, and hopefully they will fix that in the upcoming version. So let's take a look at the project structure here. Here we have the platforms folder. We have Android, iOS, Mac Catalyst, and Tizen. I've not talked about Tizen earlier in this presentation, but Tizen is not an official .NET MAUI platform from Microsoft. It is Samsung that works with that. But it's also possible to use .NET MAUI and build a Tizen app. And I saw also this week on Twitter that there are some work done by the community to have a Linux version also for .NET MAUI, but that's not an official supported platform either. But here you can have Android resources that are specific for Android. If you compare it with Xamarin.Forms, you had to have all resources separate for all projects. You don't have to have that with .NET MAUI, because you have a shared resource folder here also for app icons, font, images, some raw stuff, splash screen, styles you have in Xamarin.Forms also shared, but all the other stuff here you had to have multiple times in Xamarin.Forms. Now you don't need to have that with .NET MAUI. So if we take a look at the project file here, hopefully you can see what it is here. So here we have the target frameworks, .NET 6 Android, .NET 6 iOS, .NET 6 Mac Catalyst. And then we have a condition for Windows. That's just because .NET for Mac don't support the Windows framework, of course. But if you run it on Windows, it will also include .NET 6 Windows and a specific version of .NET 6 for Windows. And what makes this a MAUI project is this on line 10. Use MAUI true, like you have for WinForms or VPF, use WinForms. Everything works the same. And if you have this, it will import all the MAUI dependencies for you. And the MAUI dependencies is installed with something that they call a workload. So you install MAUI workload. Often you do that together with Visual Studio, so you don't have to care about that. But compared with Xamarin.Forms, Xamarin.Forms was added with a NuGet package. It's not that for MAUI, at least don't right now. I heard they say that maybe it will be that in the future, because you will have releases of .NET MAUI because they do a new iOS release, for example, and that will not be at the same time frame as Visual Studio. So maybe it will be NuGet packages again, but right now it's a workload that you can install from the CLI or together with Visual Studio. And then you also have implicit usings, and that is something that you have for ASP.NET also, for example, and that means that you have global usings already added for all of your MAUI namespaces, so you don't need to add them yourself to every file or as a global using in your projects. They are already there, but if you don't want it, you can turn it off. Otherwise, you can see that you have the app identifier in here. You have versions, and this will, when you build this, it will add those to the Android manifest to info plist, so you don't need to edit them yourself. And you have the icon, it's also specified in the project file right now. The splash screen, then it's just some code here to include the folders in the project. And what they also have done is that they have aligned how the MAUI app is starting. Of course, you still have the app delegate for iOS here in the platforms folder, because that's something you need for an iOS app. But you will also have this MAUI program.cs. It's like a startup.cs in your .NET Core application, and here you have use MAUI app that tells you the framework what class is starting the MAUI, like the MAUI application inside of here, and that app file is this app.xaml and app.xaml.cs that you already also had in Xamarin.Forms, and you have a similar thing if you're doing Windows development. Then you can configure your fonts here. You can use dependency injection here, builder.services.add singleton, for example, so you don't have to add a third-party IOC container as you had to do with Xamarin. It's built in the framework now, and it's the same like all other .NET using. If you build a web API or a Blazor site, it's the same dependency injection library that you're using. Yeah, and then you have the app class here, and here you can say what the main page should be. So what you have in .NET MAUI, and that you also had in newer versions of Xamarin.Forms, is something called shell. And shell is like the main layout of your application. Like if you have a tab bar, a flyout, and shell will also handle the navigation for you. So it's pretty easy to build a tab bar with .NET MAUI. Before in Xamarin.Forms you used to have a tabbed page, and the navigation was pretty complicated, especially if we talked about the master detail page. You get headache just thinking about navigation there. But with shell, that is pretty easy. To create a tab bar, the only thing I need to do is to define a tab bar like this, and then I add shell content to this, and shell content is more or less a page or a view, if you prefer to call it that. If you do MVVM, you probably call it a view. So you can add multiple shell content here, and this content template here is the page. So this will be a tab bar at the bottom with 3 tabs, and you can also add icons here if you want to do that. Okay, so let's dive into this application that I have started with, but yeah, it doesn't really have any content yet. We can run it, and when you start, .NET MAUI application, just I can show you. You just select here what to run it for. So you don't set a startup project. For example, the iOS project should be the startup project because you don't have any iOS projects right now. You can have multiple projects for each platform with the .NET MAUI also, but it's not in the default templates. But if you want, or if you upgrade a Xamarin.Forms app, you will probably have them still, depending on how much work you want to do. But you just select what you want to start it on. For example, my Mac, the iPhone simulators, Android emulators, and if I connect devices, it will also show up here. If you're using Visual Studio on a Windows machine, to be able to use the simulators, you need to connect the Mac with the remote agent, or what they call it. But if you have an iOS device, you can plug it in and use something that they call hot restart. And if you have Apple developer account, you can deploy it to your phone without having a Mac. So you don't need to buy a Mac to get started with working with MAUI. But if you want to build the app for App Store, you need a Mac in some way. But it don't necessarily have to be a local Mac. You can use GitHub Action, Azure DevOps, or App Center, for example, to build it. But I think it's pretty nice to have a Mac because I'll be able to run it on simulators. So I can run it on different iOS devices. If you have a phone, you probably have one or maximum 2 devices. But now I can run it on iPhone 8 and see how it looks there. I can run it on iPhone 13. The screen sizes there are pretty different. But Android emulators you can of course run on both Windows and Mac. And on Windows you can even run them on the Windows subsystem for Android. I don't know if that's available in Sweden right now, but they talk about that often in presentations from Microsoft. But I'm not sure if that is available in Sweden, so I should not talk that much about it. Yeah, but we can run this on Mac, for example, because I think that is the fastest way to work is to start it on a Mac, or if you run it on Windows, it's faster to start it on as a Windows app compared to start it on an emulator or simulator. Yeah. Now it had some problems, so we start it again. Okay. I'm not used to this light mode, but they say that it's better to have it on a screen. Okay, that's why. Okay, we remove the breakpoints. Thank you. Yeah, so here it is. No content here, so maybe we can go and add some content here to this news app. And if you watch my YouTube channel, you maybe have seen me done this already because I did it in a live stream. So, the default way to work with UI in .NET MAUI is to use the MVM pattern, model view model, and you have a view and you have a view model that handles the view logic. And what's pretty nice now with .NET 6 is that you can use source generators, and there are a package called community toolkit.mvm that helps you with a lot of this stuff. So you don't have to care about writing all the properties with setters and getters and raise property changed. Everything you need to do is to add this attribute, observable property, and then it will generate the code. So you can see these items here. This items field is with a small letter, lowercase letter in the beginning, but when I use it here, I have it with uppercase. That's because I use the generated property. And for that, I also need to have the observable object attribute on the class. But right now, I have it in a base class. So yeah, and that will save you a lot of time because it reduces the codes of your view models very, very much. So we have the view models already ready here, so we can go and just add a collection view to this main view, just to show you fast how you work with .NET MAUI. So collection view, and we need item source, and then we will bind that to the items property. So every time there are changes in the observable collection that I bind to, it will also update the collection view. And I need to set is visible, because I don't want it to be visible when it's loading the data. Then I instead will have the activity indicator here that showing that data is loading. So we do binding is not busy. Then we need to add a template for each item, so we do that easy by collection view.item template, and we create a data template. Yeah, thank you. So now here we can add what content we want, so a vertical stack layout. And if you have done Windows development, you maybe know about stack panel. Stack layout is the same as stack panel, but with a different name. And we also have stack layout and horizontal stack layout. If you use the pure stack layout, you need to set orientation, but I recommend you to use vertical stack layout or horizontal stack layout instead, but because they are optimized and will give a better performance. So we can add a label here, text, binding, let's check the property, title, let's try to run it like that because we don't have that much of time left, and I want to show the Blazor stuff also. Here you also see another Visual Studio for Mac bug. There are a lot of errors that not are true. I don't really know why they have them there. Yeah, that's because I compiled the bindings. We can remove that for now. We need to set the data type on the data template to have the compiled bindings to work. And that is good of performance reason, and as you see, if I do something wrong with the bindings, it also catch it in build time instead of runtime. Yeah, okay, some problems here, but we don't care about that now. We can fix it after if you're interested to see what I did wrong. And instead we go and take a look at the Blazor app. Let's see where I have that here. I have a project where I have native clients, that is the MAUI project, and then I have a Blazor web project, in this case a Blazor server project, and then I have a shared library here with all my Blazor components. Right now just an index page, because a page and a component is basically the same in Blazor. It's just if you have this page, it will be a page. So I will reuse this content both on the web page and on the MAUI app. But let's go to the MAUI app and see how things works when you want to include Blazor content. So the first thing you need to do is to go to your MAUI program and add this here, builder.services.add MAUI Blazor web view. And if you create it from the template, it's added by default, so you don't have to care about that. And then you have here add Blazor web view developer tools, and if you have that line there, it makes it possible to use the developer tools in the browser to inspect the web UI, and that can be pretty useful if you have some errors in your Blazor components. Then you can open Safari, for example, for the iOS simulator, and just connect to the simulator, and then you can inspect it and see CSS stuff. And so, yeah, if you have errors or if you want to change the CSS without having to redeploy the app, you can do it pretty easy there. I can show you that if you have time. Otherwise, I have a video about this. It's called Inspect the Blazor Web UI. And if we take a look here, we have a www root folder, and here is where you have all the static contents. So you have an index file, and if you have done Blazor development, it is pretty much the same as in a normal Blazor project, it's just that it's inside of a MAUI project. Yeah, it's HTML. Here you have a div with the selector app, and if we go to the main page here, we have a Blazor web view that loads this index file with the host page property. Then we have Blazor web view root components, and here we say, okay, load this content into the selector with the app ID. And then we have component type, and that is the default component that we should load. And it can be, like in this example, a component with a router, and that makes it possible for us to navigate inside of the Blazor web view. If we don't have a router, we cannot do that. So if you want your complete app to be Blazor web view, you should have a router so you can navigate between the pages as you do in a normal Blazor app. But if you just want to have a small component inside of a .NET MAUI page, you don't need to have a router. Then you can just use the component directly. The only thing you do then is to change to another component here. But to make this code reusable, I have all components, as said, in a shared project here, so I can use them both for web and for the app. Another thing that are different is this project.sdk property. Instead of Microsoft Net SDK, you have Microsoft Net SDK.razor, and that is something that is important, otherwise it cannot use the Blazor stuff inside of this project. When you create a default project from template, you also have some Blazor components inside of here, but I recommend to have it in a specific library, because that makes it possible for you to reuse the components later. So we can try to run this and see how it works. So let's run it on Mac. And this is not a very fancy UI, it's just a list of some data, and I also have that I show the position of the user, but that will not work on Mac. We need to run it on iAssemblator. And take that one that I already started. That one. And what I've done here to be able to use the location service on both web and on the MAUI side is that I've created an interface. So we can go here to the shared project. I have a iGeo service with get position. Then I have different implementation of that in the native client and in the web client. So here I'm using something called MAUI Essentials, and MAUI Essentials is more or less a library for abstracting away platform stuff that are located to hardware, and yeah, like geolocation, you have the accelerometer, so you don't need to write that code for each platform. So the only thing I need to do here is geolocation.default get location async, and on the web it will look like this. I'm using a JS interrupt to use the JavaScript APIs for getting position, and this is a NuGet package I installed, so I don't have to write that myself. But it's not using the same code, and the only thing I need to do is to go to program.cs and I configure the dependency injection container different. So let's see if the app started. Yep, here it is. Let's see if we can make it a little bit bigger. It's not something fancy, but you can see my position here, and you can see the web content here. Just a list I have done. Okay, we have 5 minutes left, so my idea is to save that for questions. And you can also come to me after this session if you have questions and don't want to ask them in front of everyone here. So I will be here for another 10-15 minutes, or you can catch me wherever you want during the day. So let's open up for questions. I have one there. Not any official plans for Linux support for .NET MAUI, but as I said, there are an open source project. I think there are some Microsoft people involved in that too, but I guess they doing that just because they think it's fun, not as a part of their day job. Not really, because you will have the native look already in the box. The text box will, or .NET MAUI entry will look like a UI text box on iOS, so you will always have the native look on all platforms. But with Xamarin.Forms, for example, you had the options to add the material look on both iOS and Android. But you will not have that now because Google not supporting their material library for iOS anymore. So they don't have that in .NET MAUI right now, but you will always get the native look out of the box. But then you also have some third-party vendors like GrialKit that have some stuff that makes it easier for you to write a beautiful UI. What does the answer all your questions, or? Yeah, okay. I don't know if there are any Blazor libraries for get the native look on all platforms, but I know there are libraries if you want to have a material design in Blazor. You have the Fluent libraries, have the Fluent look on the Blazor side, but I don't think there are Blazor libraries that can have the iOS look and if you run it on iOS, and the Android look if you run it on Android. So, not what I know. We have a question there. Yep. I don't have any numbers, but I think the app package will be around 20 megabyte or something like that. So it will be much more than it was in the beginning of Xamarin, for example. And of course it will use a bit more memory than a Swift or Objective-C app, but in those modern phones I don't think it really matters for performance. Yeah, around that, because it will bake in the .NET runtime into the package. We have there. No, you. Yeah. I'm not sure if they have an actual plan for that right now. What they say is that we will listen to the users. So if you want that, give them that feedback. But I know there are a lot of developers that don't like to write UI in XAML. So yeah, I think it will. They need to do something like that because XAML can be pretty complicated to get started with. A lot of code you need, a lot of things you need to know, like the bindings, the view models, the XAML. I'm a big fan of the Blazor syntax as they had in the Blazor mobile project, so you will not have, like I showed you now with the web UI with Blazor, you will have the native controls, but you write them in with the Blazor syntax, so you can combine it with C# code and yeah, so on. Yes. Good question. Because you load the CSS file in the index file, so I don't know if it's possible to add different CSS files in the component, but you cannot add them there. But you can probably do that in the project file, setting conditions on build time. If you build this for iOS, include this CSS file. That should be possible. No, my time is up. So, but we can continue to talk outside here if you have more questions. But now I need to leave.